Wow, that's great.
Okay. Well, I'd like to begin on a cheery note. Thank you all for coming. I got a postcard from a friend, and the message on the postcard is, I know you will like this card. Make America great again.
I'm surprised it got through the postal service.
The other good news is that there was a new Archbishop of Canterbury, and she is a woman, Sarah Mullally. She is the first woman Archbishop of Canterbury in 1,400 years.
Oh my gosh.
Everything's coming down.
Also, Thad, do you mind if I say something?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, Thad is sending around a video by a seminary professor who draws on Bonhoeffer to argue against white Christian nationalism. I think it's very good.
Yeah. And I couldn't remember, my memory of course, I couldn't remember everybody in class, so some of you didn't get it yet, but that's what I'm looking around at.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
I'll get you.
You will still get it if you
I'll
haven't
write
already.
it down here.
Okay. And I want to thank Charles and Mary, who are doing terrific assistance for these 5 weeks, and I really do appreciate it. I think it helped to move the chairs. Going around have been 2 handouts. One is just a kind of bibliography brief that we got, bibliography of biographies of Bonhoeffer, books interpreting his thought that were stimulated by prison writings, and then a couple of documentary films. I don't recommend either of the feature films, one of which was made last year. And then I have 3 quotes from Bultmann on the purpose of mythology. I'll be covering this morning. Okay. So I'm just going to jump right in on Bultmann. Well, I did want to just show you my book on Bonhoeffer, that it actually exists. And they did a nice job on the cover, so it's all pretty dark. The back cover is Bonhoeffer himself. The back doesn't have it. So, Rudolf Bultmann, demythologizing the New Testament. There we go. Rudolf Bultmann was an eminent 20th century New Testament scholar and theologian. He's best known for his use of form criticism, as it's called, to interpret the Gospels, and also for his proposal that the New Testament needs to be demythologized and reinterpreted with the help of an existentialist analysis of lived human existence. Rudolf Bultmann was born August 20th, 1884. I meant to check that because Paul Tillich seems to have been born on August the 20th, 1884. In Wiefelstede, Germany. He was the son of a Lutheran pastor and the grandson of a missionary, but he always intended to follow an academic career in theology. By the way, 3 of our 4 makers were the sons of pastors, Bart, Bultmann, and Tillich. At the age of 19, Bultmann began his theological studies at the University of Tübingen and continued them at the universities of Berlin and Marburg, studying with the leading biblical scholars of his day. He submitted a dissertation and received a graduate degree from the University of Marburg in 1910. Then, of course, he had to write his inaugural dissertation to get a job on a faculty. And in 1912, he was appointed a lecturer in New Testament at the University of Marburg. He taught for a few years at the University of Breslau and then the University of Gießen before returning to Marburg as professor of New Testament. Bultmann remained at Marburg until his retirement in 1951. And as a matter of fact, he lived in Marburg until his death. In 1917, Bultmann married Helena Feldman. They had 3 daughters. In 1921, Bultmann published a book that would launch his scholarly career and establish his reputation. It was called History of the Synoptic Tradition. It was an analysis of the sources in the early Christian tradition that Mark, Matthew, and Luke drew on in writing their Gospels and how they used those sources. Bultmann was a leading proponent of what's called form criticism, the attempt to get behind the written sources of biblical texts to identify the forms or genres, types, in which an originally oral tradition was transmitted. Because one assumes that the earliest followers of Jesus were transmitting his sayings and stories about him orally. So we have types or forms such as parables, proverbs, collections of a teacher's or holy person's sayings, miracle stories. And Bultmann, like other historians of religion, was looking at these in other religious traditions as well, for comparative purposes. In 1926, Bultmann followed the history of the Synoptic tradition with a book entitled Jesus. The German title was Jesus. The English translation title is Jesus and the Word. I hasten to say that Jesus and the Word is not a life of Jesus. Bultmann did not believe it was possible to write a life of the historical Jesus. He writes about the historical background of Jesus' ministry, but the book might best be called a portrait of Jesus entirely through his teachings. Bultmann was a prolific writer. That's just a sampler of his major writings over his career. The Gospel of John, a commentary, is a big book, published in 1941. And John and Paul were favorites of Bultmann. He drew from them a good deal. And then he wrote his programmatic demythologizing essay, New Testament and Mythology, which was published in a volume called Kerygma and Myth, Kerygma, the proclamation. Primitive Christianity in its original setting, published in 1949. Primitive here doesn't mean, it simply means early. Theology of the New Testament, which was 2 volumes. That is his kind of overarching theological statement. History and Eschatology in 1957, which were his Gifford lectures at the University of Edinburgh. And then Jesus Christ and Mythology, which were Bultmann's Terry lectures at Yale University. And I'll be coming back to it, growing on that. At Marburg, the years he was in Marburg, Bultmann became well acquainted with a philosopher named Martin Heidegger, who during that period in the 1920s wrote what would become Oh, I need to, there we go. During the period that they were colleagues at the University of Harvard, Martin Heidegger published what would become a classic of existentialist philosophy and one of the most influential books of philosophy of the 20th century, Being and Time, another one of those abstract titles, which was published in 1927. It was a highly original, groundbreaking analysis of the general characteristics of lived human existence, or what they call the human life world. How we are actually in the world as subjects, as selves, relating to the things in the world, to one another, to time and space, and to death. Bultmann was profoundly influenced by Being and Time, believing that Heidegger had developed a philosophical understanding of human existence that was strikingly parallel to the understanding of human existence found in the New Testament writings, particularly of Paul and John. As a theologian, Bultmann believed that the task of theology requires a self-conscious and deliberate basis in a philosophical analysis of what it is to be human. A theologian like Barth, he believed, tacitly employed a number of general philosophical assumptions, but mistakenly imagined that he was rejecting any appeal to anything outside Scripture and confessional testimony. Everyone brings to the interpretation of texts presuppositions that they did not derive from the text they're interpreting. And that was a key idea for Bultmann. Bultmann believed it was essential to be aware of that and to be upfront about it in one's thinking. It was during his years of discussion with Heidegger that Bultmann developed his own theological perspective, that Christian faith is and should be centered on the Christ of faith, not the historical Jesus. That, of course, in itself is a break with the liberal tradition. Christian faith is a response to the kerygma, the New Testament proclamation of repentance and new life through the revelation of God in Christ. We encounter the kerygma in the church's preaching and teaching, and faith is receiving the kerygma as a personal address to me. So at this point, Bultmann completely rejected the liberal Protestant belief that Christian faith should or even could be based on the historical Jesus. Bultmann argued that all that matters is the thatness of Jesus, not the whatness. Only that Jesus existed, preached, died by crucifixion, not what happened throughout his life. He believed he found biblical support for this view, especially in the letters of Paul. Like the other three of our four theologians, Bultmann had also read and been influenced by the writings of the 19th century Danish writer Søren Kierkegaard, who is considered one of the primary sources of existentialism. In his book, Philosophical Fragments, Kierkegaard takes a similar view of faith as a response to the kerygma, the Christ proclaimed by the early church in the New Testament, and not to a Jesus stripped down to what we can know of him as a historical figure, which for Bultmann tends to be rather skeptical in his assessment of what parts of the Gospels were added later or interpretation by the early church, and which ones were actually sayings of Jesus. And it's interesting because I think in this regard he was somewhat influenced by Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, one of his most important books is a book called Philosophical Fragments. And there his Kierkegaard wrote his most important books under pseudonyms, and he changed the pseudonyms, so he didn't just adopt one pseudonym. So this one is by Johannes Climacus. He also wrote a book written by hilarious bookbinder, and he did have a sense of humor, even though he was a rather melancholy Dane. But in this book, he deals with the question, can the truth be learned? To put it another way, in what relationship do human beings stand to the truth? Now by truth here, he doesn't mean you and I are all together in this room. Water consists of two atoms of hydrogen and one of oxygen, or even E equals mc squared. He means eternal essential truth, as he calls it, namely God, the meaning of human life, the destiny of human beings, and the rest. So he's dealing with the question, to what extent can that be learned? And he has two models. One is Socrates, who argued that the truth is within us already, and it simply needs to be drawn out. And he actually has a dialogue called the Meno, in which Plato has a dialogue called the Meno, in which Socrates calls a slave boy over, and just by asking him the right questions, gets him to come up with a geometric proof. So that's the Socratic view, and he opposes to that a model, and here he refers to the person who presents this view simply as the teacher, but this is obviously Jesus. Now, this view of our relationship to the truth is that not only is it not in us, we are running away from it. And that we depend entirely upon the teacher or to be in the truth. And the teacher is the paradox, as he called it. The teacher is completely God and completely a human being. The teacher is both the eternal and the historical. And that's a paradox to human reason. But it's the encounter, it's the faith encounter with that. And so he actually discusses the question, well, did the contemporary followers of Jesus have an advantage over later generations? I mean, you know, if you lived where Jesus lived and you heard him preach and this kind of thing, wouldn't that be an advantage? And he says, absolutely not. And he gives the example of somebody who's a contemporary of Jesus. He says, if there was a contemporary who had lived abroad and came home just when that teacher had only a day or two to live, if in turn that contemporary was prevented by business affairs from getting to see that teacher and arrived on the scene only at the very end when he was about to breathe his last, would this historical ignorance be an obstacle to his being able to be a follower of, if the moment was for him the decision of eternity? So he imagines somebody, you know, who never actually gets to know Jesus, but he encounters the paradox of Jesus as the eternal in time and accepts it in faith. So I think that the account in Philosophical Fragments had some influence on Bultmann. Well, Heidegger distinguished between inauthentic and authentic modes of human existence. Either living without much awareness of who you are, your situation. That's what he called the they self, in German, das Man. Without realizing who I am as a finite self with unique possibility. Or I can consciously take hold of my life's possibility in the face of the inevitable but unpredictable reality of death. Appropriating Heidegger's vocabulary of inauthentic and authentic, Bultmann Christianized the terms in the light of the curriculum. Because of sin, we're incapable on our own of achieving authenticity. The true authenticity is attained through faith, through opening ourselves to the possibility of a new existence in Christ. Very importantly, Bultmann, the existentialist theologian, maintained that Christianity is not a worldview that we subscribe to as if it were objective knowledge. This is very Kierkegaard. Only in faith can we authentically speak of God, of Christ, or even of the world as God's creation. And faith is never a possession, but a constantly renewed decision. As a theologian, Bultmann was deeply and actively concerned about the relevance of Christianity to people living their lives in the modern world. And in this he shared fully with the liberal Protestant tradition. His approach to interpreting the New Testament and making sense of the Christian proclamation is called demythologizing. In 1942, Bultmann published this programmatic essay I mentioned called New Testament and Mythology. He defined very specifically what he meant by mythology, and that's the first quotation on your handout. Mythology is the use of imagery to express the otherworldly in terms of this world and the divine in terms of human life, the other side in terms of this side. For instance, divine transcendence is expressed as spatial distance. In the New Testament, the Christian proclamation of creation, sin, and redemption is expressed largely in terms of the mythology of first century Judaism, a three-story universe comprised of heaven, earth, and hell, hierarchies of angels and devils, possession of humans by evil spirits, miracles abounding, and vivid and detailed apocalyptic expectations of the imminent end of the world. Thus, in the New Testament, God is pictured as dwelling in heaven. Hell has a location in which human torments are described in physical terms, and the evils in the world are ascribed to Satan as the ruler of this world and to evil spirits as malevolent beings who go about possessing people and making them mentally and physically ill. But mythologies have a purpose that can be distinguished from the mythologies themselves. The real purpose of myth, Bultmann writes, actually I think this is the one I have on there, is not to present an objective picture of the world as it is, but to express man's understanding of himself and the world in which he lives. Myth should be interpreted not cosmologically, but anthropologically, or better still, existentially. This has something having to do with my existence as a human being. Myth speaks of the power or the powers which man supposes he experiences as the ground and limit of his world and of his own activity and suffering. Myth is an expression of man's conviction that the origin and purpose of the world in which he lives are to be sought not within it, but beyond it. Myth is also an expression of man's awareness that he is not lord of his own being. Myth expresses man's belief that in this state of dependence, he can be delivered from the forces within the visible world. This existential interpretation of what is enshrined in myth is not itself mythological. It's the permanent foundational element of what Bultmann believed to be the Christian message. An understanding that he believed is fully compatible with modern science.
Why did he choose to use the word myth? Is that something in German that's different than in English?
Well, that's a standard. Myth and mythology are very standard terms for anybody who studies religion. And Bultmann gives us how he defines myth. And yeah, the language of religion is the language of symbol and myth. That's the standard approach to it.
Could you define what you mean by existentialism in this case? I think I'm just coming from my own ignorance because I'm mostly thinking of like Sartre and Camus, and of course, that's
No.
completely outside of religion.
Ironically, most of the existentialists were religious. Anyway, this is a very diverse group of philosophers. The existentialists really belong to the 20th century. Very diverse group of philosophers and writers who, in one way or another, were trying to analyze what it is to be human from the inside, so to speak. They were trying to understand general characteristics of human existence as lived by human beings. That is not from an external scientific point of view, but as we actually experience them. So that's really what they were trying to do. And Heidegger's book is a prime example. So Bultmann argues that there's nothing specifically Christian in the mythical view of the world as such. It is simply the cosmology of a pre-scientific age. The Christian message is that the authentic life is a life based on unseen, intangible realities, the abandonment of all self-contrived security, faith that the unseen, intangible reality actually confronts us as love, opening up our future and signifying not death but life. Now, the obvious question is, but isn't all talking about God, the unseen, intangible reality, inherently mythological? 1951, Bultmann gave the Schaeffer lectures. Well, I mentioned this, and they were the Terry lectures. They were the Schaeffer lectures at Yale Divinity School, which were later published under the title Jesus Christ and Mythology, at less than 100 pages. This is the book to read if you want an introduction to Bultmann without tears. Here Bultmann explains that to speak existentially of God as active in the world and in our lives, confronting us as love, is not mythological, but analogical. We're talking analogously when we talk about God. And so I have this quotation. When we speak in this manner of God as acting, we conceive God's action as an analog to the actions taking place between human beings. We conceive the communion between God and humans as an analog to our communion with one another. It is in this analogical sense that we speak of God's love and care for us, of his demands and his wrath, of his promises and his grace. And it is in this analogical sense that we call him Father. Bultmann is arguing that even in a world explained by the sciences, it's legitimate to speak of an unseen, non-physical reality that grounds, sustains, and is active in the world. That's because science is limited to physical explanations of physical phenomena, while human beings as subject inhabit a world of meanings, values, choices, community, the human life world I was mentioning earlier, through and in terms of which the transcendent reality of God manifests itself to them. The appropriate language for speaking of the reality and activity of the unseen God is metaphors taken from our experience as subjects dwelling together with other subjects in a common human world of interrelationships. God confronts humans as individual selves in the context of our lives together, and God's activity is experienced and responded to only in that existential context. And central to this interpretation of Christianity is that the only authentic affirmations about God are those that express the speaker's own experience of the divine presence and activity. Now then, Bultmann, as you know, I'm touching on justification by faith with each of our theologians. So Bultmann interpreted demythologizing in terms of the doctrine of justification by faith. No, there it is. And in Jesus Christ in mythology, he says this about demythologizing. Demythologizing is a task parallel to that performed by Paul and Luther in their doctrine of justification by faith alone without the works of law. More precisely, demythologizing is the radical application of the doctrine of justification by faith in the sphere of knowledge and thought. Like the doctrine of justification, demythologizing destroys every longing for security. There is no difference between security based on good works and security built on objectifying knowledge. He who abandons every form of security shall find the true security. So that's his take. And next week we'll see that Paul Tillich does something similar to that. Bultmann's view of modern science and also, of course, encompassed evolutionary theory, and he regarded the Genesis creation stories as mythological expressions of an understanding of human existence that can be expressed non-mythologically. Well, what about Bultmann and his immediate context, which was Germany in the 1920s and 30s? He was critical of Nazism from the beginning, and between 1933 and 1941, he was involved in a series of struggles regarding Nazi influence on the universities and the Protestant Church. Bultmann objected to the Nazi claim to authority over all aspects of German life, and he refused to modify his teaching and preaching in any way to suit Nazi ideology. He was a member of the Confessing Church. He specifically rejected the Nazi disenfranchisement of all Jews from civic organizations and professions, calling it incompatible with the essence of the Christian Church. At the same time, as Bultmann himself put it, he never directly and actively participated in political affairs. He did remain an active leader and participant in the worship and the community of the church throughout his life. With the resumption of contacts between the German universities and the rest of the world after World War II, Bultmann became a major international academic figure. Throughout his career, Bultmann was an excellent teacher who encouraged independence of mind among his students. That's something I've always particularly admired. And among his students were those who themselves became leading biblical scholars and theologians in the decades following the war. They built on his work, but felt free to take issue with Bultmann's own views. That was a hallmark of his students. Among these students were, I've mentioned a few of them, Günther Bornkamm and Ernst Käsemann, both of whom actually wrote Bultmann-inflected studies of the historical Jesus. And Gerhard Ebeling, who built on Bultmann's existentialist interpretation. Another one of his students, by the way, just as a passing observation, back in the 1920s had been Hannah Arendt, who wrote about Nazism, Eichmann on trial. Bultmann himself lectured widely outside of Germany. Notable among his lecture series were the Schaeffer lectures in the U.S. and the Gifford lectures in Britain. His topic in the Gifford lectures was history and eschatology. He lived out his days quietly in Marburg and died on July 30th, 1976, at the age of 91. I just want to return briefly to Bonhoeffer on Bultmann. Where you have this in the initial Bonhoeffer and from first session. Bultmann seems to have somehow felt Barth's limitations, but he misconstrues them in the sense of liberal theology, and so goes off into the typical liberal process of reduction. The mythological elements of Christianity are dropped, and Christianity is reduced to its essence. Actually, Bultmann never says that he is getting rid of the mythology of the New Testament, but reinterpreting it. He's very often misunderstood in that school. This was his reinterpretation. He was not calling on the church to throw out the mythological elements. And then Bonhoeffer says, my view is that the full content, including the mythological concepts, must be kept. This mythology is the thing itself, but the concept must be interpreted in such a way as not to make religion a precondition of faith. And on this, I don't understand Bonhoeffer. Anyway, so, and Bultmann himself does express his appreciation for the liberal Protestant tradition, as certainly does Tillich. I think that's maybe it. Yeah.
So, he did not, Bultmann didn't get involved with, trying to get rid of Hitler, or he didn't get into the
No.
political thing, and that's why he probably was not taken to prison.
Probably so, yeah. He experienced harassment and that sort of thing, but he stayed within the university context. And as he says, he was not a politically active person. But in his work, he tried to refuse to follow the Nazi orders. But
Defense of the Jews was.
yeah, he defended Jews.
Is Bultmann's scholarship considered relevant by contemporary theologians today?
Relevant, the form criticism fell out of favor. And there would be more attention and more, as there was originally, to the texts as we have it, and how those were put together. But I think he's left a legacy that's important, that continues to be a source for New Testament scholars to come.
So much of the mythology he was criticizing, was it in the Old Testament, or was part of it?
No, this is New Testament.
In the New Testament
Yeah.
too, because you mentioned Genesis
Yeah.
and
Right.
He was certainly relevant to my seminary professors.
What?
He was relevant to my seminary professors.
Mine too.
Same here, same here.
Yeah, yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about what we mean by mythology in the New Testament? Because to many of us, of course, mythology is things like Roman gods and Greek gods, and how the term mythology fits into something that we believe to be true.
Yeah, but why should we regard the Greek and Roman stories as mythology and not recognize the mythological elements in the Hebrew and Christian stories?
What are some examples?
Yeah, could you give us examples? I mean.
Well, I thought I did.
Well, you,
I was talking about the three-story universe and angels and devils.
Yeah, you said that.
and
But for example, Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount, would that have is there a meaning of
No.
mythology that applies to that?
I don't see that as mythological. A lot of Jesus' teachings are not. But the framework within which early Christian thinking was done contained mythological elements inherited from Judaism.
What about the virgin birth? Would that be considered mythology by Bultmann?
It actually would be like,
and the miracle.
because of course, as a historian of religion,
What about the miracles?
he knew that there were virgin birth stories and other traditions in this
Jan, what about the miracles in the New Testament? I know some people consider those mythological.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so that would be
I
another
think it depends.
example, okay.
I think clearly those in which Jesus is a healer are miracles we can relate to without much trouble. Those like walking on water, turning water into wine, those would be more controversially.
Thanks. Does it go as far as addressing the resurrection?
That's an interesting.
I don't wanna put you on the spot, but I get that in.
No, I think Bultmann simply affirms the resurrection, but once you've affirmed it, then there would be different ways of interpreting what happened with the resurrection.
I think if some of the younger people that I've had experience.
There would be a lot of variety among New Testament scholars in interpreting the resurrection stories. The earliest witness to the resurrection is Paul in 1 Corinthians. And, 1 Corinthians 15. And he's reporting, and of course he's regarding his own conversion experience as a resurrection appearance. Yeah. And all he says is Jesus appeared to Peter, 12, up to 500 at one time, and so forth. The very bottom line is that how do you explain how a group of completely discouraged people who thought that it was all over were turned around and went out to preach the gospel to the world? I mean, that's sort of the part that you can weave things around, but that's what happened.
Is that what you just did? Is that an example of demythologizing? Pulling it apart and.
Well, I suppose. I suppose it could be. Yeah, but I'm not in the category of myth. And I'm just saying that, you know, there are a number of different views of Jesus' resurrection, but there's a kind of bottom line issue of how did everybody become completely changed by what happened? Yeah.
Does Bultmann come up with any kind of test or standard as to the Gospels, what we can consider as genuine and what was added later, or is he just, is it all for anybody, your own interpretation?
Oh, I mean, gosh, he's a historian, and he really goes through the text, and the evidence, and, you know, you just have to go to his books and see. And, well, in the book, Jesus and Word, is, that's a good example of his critical historical approach to the Testament. Yeah.
Well, how could he come to a decision about what was historical and what was not in today's technology?
How could he come to a decision?
Yeah,
Well,
if he's
well,
trying to
it's-
separate, this was historical, but this was
Yeah,
not.
yeah. Well, it was based on his, what he knew about the situation at that time, about these different oral traditions that lay behind the gospel writings.
But that, again, that's subjective. How do we know what the oral traditions were? They were oral.
Well,
We know that some were written down,
Yeah.
but
well, with ancient history particularly, historians have to exercise a lot of judgment.
yeah,
They
that's
have
my
to weigh,
point.
they have to weigh things on the basis of
Yeah,
their judgment of how strong the evidence is.
right.
And of course, there are also textual variations through the centuries, the early centuries. And so that's what they work with. And Bultmann tended to take a more skeptical, he leaned skeptical. Other very learned New Testament scholars have leaned more in the direction of regarding the accounts as basically trustworthy. So that remains a debate among historians.
I can't help but remember my introduction to Bultmann and how, in a way it was a relief and it was exciting and yet confusing, because how do you trust, as you mentioned, how do you trust the scriptures if you really need to know the mythological experience of people of that time? They wrote after Jesus' death, and still you have to say we are all influenced by our mythological understanding. And so for the scriptures to be understood, you had to understand that mythology of that time. And how do you actually get underneath? That's why I still think that historical Jesus has merit, even though it itself doesn't claim it knows the truth. But it'll always be an adventure. It'll always be an investigation, it seems to me. And Bultmann, I think, led the way for that. And he doesn't
Well,
give the answers, but he certainly gives the questions that I
Yeah.
found liberating.
He raises very important
It
questions.
seems to me it's a, and I think this is in here somewhere, I'm not sure. I don't know, it seems to me it's somewhat of a personal journey of what you study and come to believe to a certain extent on your own as an individual. And that's a constantly morphing process with many of us, including myself, based on knowledge I acquire. But it might broaden my faith, but it doesn't affect the basics overall, at least in my own opinion. Anyway,
Yeah, well,
just,
Yeah, I have the same problem with Bultmann. On the one hand, he's saying, well, Christianity is just encountering and accepting the charisma, the proclamation, the New Testament proclamation of Jesus as the Christ. On the other hand, indeed, with demythologizing, he's saying, well, but we have to completely reinterpret all this in such a way that it doesn't depend upon mythology. And that's a unless you're actually wanting to get rid of the mythology, which would be a drastic measure, there's a certain tension there between, well, yes, our faith has to do with what's proclaimed in the New Testament. The problem being that what's proclaimed in the New Testament is a lot of mythology bound up in it. So,
If Bultmann was studying the historical Jesus, why is it that he took Paul's version of justification by faith as opposed to Jesus' version of justification by repent and return to God? Jesus, that's
Well-
what we have in the synoptic gospels, but we go with what Paul taught.
well, with the doctrine of justification by faith really comes from Paul.
Right, right.
And,
But that's not what Jesus taught.
well, Bultmann's view is that Paul and John, and along with the gospel, are our guides to who Christ was and what the early church believes about him. And actually, Paul says almost nothing about the ministry of Jesus.
He didn't know it.
For him, Jesus was the crucified and risen Lord who had encountered him directly. And that was what he was going on. And of course, he was also learning about Jesus from other people who had been with him and this kind of thing. But he doesn't talk much about that.
Yeah, the confusion reigns, but even more now, there are scholars that are saying that immediately after Jesus' death, the church the people that gathered, they didn't focus on the resurrection.
No.
They focused on how do we survive and how important it was to gather in communities because we had an example of that. And so out of that came an experience maybe of the resurrection. It was an existential experience that later Paul and others, they had a mystical experience. I don't know, the dependence on the resurrection has gotten, I think, simplified so much that we still need to raise the questions about it as we are here. And I think that's why the church is so important to share our questions.
Oh, sure.
To share our questions and not go off and, chasing rabbits everywhere, so.
Jim, all of my seminary professors denied the existence of a historical Jesus. They really didn't believe in the historical Jesus. I found myself wondering, well, why am I here if there was no,
Is there not?
On the other hand,
Gosh, you
well,
know.
they were grounded in this kind of thing. I kind of cheerfully disagreed, but they were so useful in terms of, if you know a little bit about the history of the Presbyterian Church, we went through a period in the early teens when Princeton Seminary was basically literalist and fundamentalist.
Yeah, that's right.
And these theologians got us out of that. They provided a way forward that was genuinely faithful, but didn't have to be literal.
Right.
So I'm always grateful to them for their work.
Yeah.
On the other hand, sometimes I thought, well, they threw out the baby, the bathwater, the bathtub, and half the plumbing. So I would just put some of that back in, for myself, and I needed Marcus Borg was really helpful to
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
Rediscovering Jesus again for the first time. That was a great book. I needed Jesus with his feet on the ground and who's Jewish, because then I can get the social justice prophets of the Old Testament,
Mm-hmm.
which has always been central to my faith. So. Anyway, for what it's worth.
Well, look at Bart. I mean, Bart goes through all this, you know, his teachers are different, Muslim, scholars, theologians, and so forth. And he reads the Bible with new eyes, and he ends up affirming all the great doctrines of Christianity. He stands with the ancient creeds and with the great confessions of the church, but he does it in a non-fundamentalist way. But he still ends up sounding very conservative.
Yes.
And so, and he had a big influence, particularly on German theology in the 50s, 60s. But people like Bultmann felt that Bart didn't go nearly far enough and that he was fudging. But certainly Bart had a lot of company.
Who are the cutting edge theologians today that are influencing thought?
I don't know.
Neither do I.
Anybody know? My younger teaching years were great years of the emergence of liberation theology, feminist theology, and so there were big names, but who's being theologian today?
You know, there's a variety. I mean, Thomas
Yeah, just-
Berry, you know, is one. He was a follower of Chardin in the Catholic tradition.
Mhm.
You're right, the feminists, we have the black theology, James Cone, I mean, other
Yeah.
people. It's just a hodgepodge, and it's kind of exciting because you gotta read them and say, well, how does this one square with this other one? And,
Mhm.
so it really forces one, and sort of me, to make some decisions. Okay, where am I? And, but then I do that, and the next week I'm somewhere else, so.
That's okay.
So I think that's the challenge, particularly when you say the church. I think it really asks the church, it's gotta look at itself and maybe change
Mhm.
to where we have a chance to have more of these discussions rather than the imposition of somebody in the pulpit deciding for us. And certainly Helen doesn't do that, but there are some that would like to say, this is the way it is, folks. Take it or leave it.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Certainty.
And that's always been the case, I realize.
That's, yeah. And that's, you know,
Start on the back.
there's that human craving for certainty and security.
You bet.
And if you've got it all laid out in 10 points or whatever, this is the truth, complete with biblical quotations, a lot of people are very drawn to that.
Well, I'm almost shut up, just a minute, maybe. But you know, it's like this, which some of you will get this recording by, on Bonhoeffer and white nationalism.
Yeah.
Well, this guy, African American, but again, he points out that Bonhoeffer was so influenced, as these were, by the Nazis and by war and the context. And really
Yeah.
said, as Bonhoeffer said, you've got to deal with your context. You can't go into fantasy land. You've got to deal with reality,
That's right.
which is scary at times. It's scary now in a way. But
Scary
we've
now.
got to face it. And so what do we do if we face it? I think that's the main thing that's going on about here. And maybe that's part of the resurrection is it calls us to face the reality that we live in as we experience it.
Mhm.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. Yeah, and in the final analysis, it also comes down to each person's personal appropriation of what's going on in their context, what's their faith tradition, and all of this.
And I think of, not knowing your own, but I think all this indigenous has maybe reminded me anyway of how important our place from whence we came, which we were born, and our early years, how it continues to influence how we approach scripture, how we approach experiences. We all have to go through that filter and recognize it, or we're just fooling ourselves, taking on somebody else.
Yeah. Nature, nurture, and
That's right.
circumstance.
That's right.
Well, gosh, I really enjoyed this discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the microphone, that really helps.
Okay, good. Yes, that's Charles.
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Charles.
Wayne. Wayne came up with it.
Got a bunch of old people that hearing is just, it is
Right.
to me.